Hello again and thanks for joining. So today we've got another Hornby model. It's in their railroad range and it's number R3276. It's a 440 compound steam locomotive and it says it's with a Fowler tender, and you can see it's in a really attractive black LMS livery. We're going to have a look at that today. Now, as usual, this is a second-hand purchase of mine, but you can see that the box is in really good condition. There's a slight little bash up here in the corner and another couple of bashes here on the other corner. So I do think this model has been out of the box a few times before, or else the box has just been on a shelf somewhere. You can see here on the edge of the box that it says it is a railroad model, so that's Hornby's budget range. And you can also see that, as with many modern locomotives, this one is DCC ready. It doesn't come with a chip in it, or at least I'm assuming that because this is second hand. I don't think it's been fitted with a chip though, but we'll see that when we give it a try later on in the video. Okay, so let's get this opened up and we'll have a look at it. So inside this box we do have some instructions, and you can see that this covers a number of different locomotives, including our compound here, but also a country, a hunt and a schools class. But this gives you some maintenance information, some handy tips about how to run this model. Inside there's quite detailed information on how to lubricate this model and also how to remove the tender body from the chassis down here on the bottom left, and you can fit your chip here. So the model is held in this polystyrene tray and it's quite securely held there, and it has a plastic sleeve over the top of it. We also have this bag with the standard vacuum pipes, which you can add on to this model if you want. Okay, let's get this out of the packaging and we'll have a look. Okay, well, here we have the model, and it really didn't want to come out the packaging there at all. It got really stuck at the front, but I managed to ease it out and hopefully I haven't broken anything. We can check that out in more detail in a moment. What strikes you straight away is this is quite a simple looking model because it's all in black with simple lettering on it and the red buffer beam, so there's not a lot of decoration here, but it does look quite classy because the valve gear has this tarnished look to it and it's kind of dulled down, a bit more realistic. So let's have a look at this in more detail. So I'm going to have to be careful with this locomotive because there doesn't seem to be any way of disconnecting the tender, because you have this cable running from the locomotive to the tender. As we saw in the instructions, the chip for the DCC would be in the tender here. You can unscrew that drawbar there, but then there's no way to unclip the wires, so it looks like it's permanently coupled together. So we're going to have to be quite careful. So looking down the front of the locomotive, one thing I've noticed straight away is this little pony truck here with the first two sets of wheels really does have quite a lot of movement in it. It's quite extensive, and it also moves like this as well. So I think that'll be okay when it's on the track, but there is so much space there that it does look a bit unprototypical. And you can also see that screw there which is holding it together with this bar which attaches to the rest of the locomotive. So that's a bit of a disappointment straight from the start, and the disappointment for me carries on because you've got this massive big coupling here, but thankfully it's not part of the truck because you can see the screw there if you wanted to take this off, which I would always do on a locomotive like this. So at the front here you can see the buffer beam painted in red, and Hornby do this very well where they don't have any fuzziness at the edges of the paint, and that's evident here. It's very nicely done, very crisp and clear, and there's a nice amount of rivet detail on that buffer beam as well. There's an indication of the screw link coupling there and the hook, but it's not very well done. There's also a hole here, but that's for the vacuum pipe we saw in the extra bag. There's not a lot of detail here on this panel, but then when you look at the door at the front of the smoke box, it's very nicely moulded with a lot of detail. The hinges and the little screw down locks around it look very convincing. You can see the number 1072 there printed on the front, but you will see it's just slightly off center of that, and it's been printed a little high. The rest of the moulding down the side of the boiler looks very convincing, and you have this extra handrail here. So this is just a piece of plastic, I think, but it is a separately moulded part that's been fitted on there. And further down here there is some additional detail moulded into the plastic, but you will see that the moulding has this line running the whole length of the boiler where the two halves of the mould have joined together, and I think that's a little bit too pronounced for this model, and it's certainly not very nice along this part here. There's a nice representation of whistles here and this extra part that's been added in, which is made of metal there. At the cab, the number 1072 is being very nicely printed onto this, and there's some other details as well, like the rivets further up here, and this handrail here has been very nicely moulded in, and there's some space in between it and the main piece of the body. So that's quite nicely done. And you can also see inside the cab here there's a representation of the controls at the back of the boiler boiler there. And looking here, you can see that the windows are nicely moulded, but there's no glazing on them at all. And up on the top, there's some nice rivet detail on the top of the cab there. So looking at the valve gear, it is very nicely made in metal here and attached to these wheels, and it's quite a simple thing. It's only one bar and running up to the piston here. It's quite a simple design, but then that would be in keeping with the prototype. You can see some additional rivet detail there, so the chassis has got some nice details on it. And the brake block here is very impressively close to the wheel as well, but it doesn't actually touch. That's really quite nice. On the other side of the locomotive, we have this additional part that's been added on as well. Looking at the tender, we have these handrails at the side here which have been added on as extra parts. I think they're actually metal, and that's really nicely done there. And you've got some detail on the tender here. You can see the coal coming through for the fireman, and you can see some other details of hatches and stuff which have been really nicely added on there in the plastic moulding. There's a lot of rivet detail here on the side of the tender, and that's very welcome, and the LMS lettering has been applied very well here too. Towards the top of the tender, there's this really nice frame around the coal. I think this is actually made in metal. The coal is not too bad. I've seen worse mouldings, but it's always a contentious point whether that coal actually looks realistic or not. Towards the rear of the tender, we've got another buffer beam picked out in red, and again, there's no fuzziness there, no problems at all. And you can see some lamp brackets and other things moulded into the back of the tender. And looking down further on the tender, there's a lot of detail here with the springs, the axle boxes, and again, further rivet detail as well. This is really quite convincing. So at the back of the tender, you have another massive Hornby coupling, but thankfully this is actually in an M pocket, so you can change this for something more prototypical. One thing I did notice as I was handling this model is it is actually pretty light. There's almost no ballast at all in the tender, so it's a really light thing. And the locomotive has a little bit of weight to it, but not really that much. The truck at the front is nicely weighted, and it does have a spring there as well, which will help it stay on the rails. So let's see if we can get the body off of the chassis and have a look at the mechanism. So there seems to be a screw here which I think is holding the locomotive together. I did notice a tab just on the back of the cab, so hopefully it's just one screw and we can get this apart. Okay, that came apart not too bad. I had to ease the body off of the chassis, and it was a bit scary because I wasn't sure if I was going to break anything, but it came off no problem and nothing's broken, so that's good. And here you can see the chassis with the motor attached to it. It's got this neat thing here where the gears have a flywheel attached to it. It's a very small flywheel, but I guess it'll do the job. And here you can see the gearbox underneath it, and it is driving obviously these back wheels here, so it's quite a simple setup. It also has this resistor at the front, and I'm guessing it must have some circuit board underneath this here as well, so I'm not going to take that apart to have a look at it because I don't think we really need to. But one thing I'm noticing on this model is there's no weight on it, so it could benefit from some additional weight here, or inside the boiler you can see that there's a hole here where there's plenty space to put some weight up there if you wanted to. That could also be a space where you could put a speaker as well. And maybe this moulding is also used for a version of this which maybe isn't railroad and does have something like a speaker up there. So let's see if we can get this working. Okay, I've just put it on to this piece of test track as is, so let's give it some power and see if it works. Okay, it works really well, so I'm going to put the body back on and then we'll give it another go. So hopefully this will be quite an easy thing to do, fingers crossed. That totally wasn't easy to get back together at all because of these parts here being so close to these steps. It kept fouling, and then I couldn't get the back tab in here at the back of the cab, but eventually I managed to get it in, but that really took quite a long time. Anyway, let's give this another try on the test track. Well, it runs pretty good, and I am actually thinking that this is a brand new model and it hasn't been run before. The wheels are very clean and there's no dirt on this whatsoever, so I'm quite lucky to have got this model, and it does run pretty good. I was a bit concerned about the front truck, and it seemed to handle the test track okay, but maybe over some points, especially if you're going at speed, you might have some problems with that, but I kind of suspect probably not. Anyway, let's see how much this locomotive weighs. So this locomotive weighs 200 grams. So overall, this compound steam locomotive from Hornby has been quite an interesting model to have a look at today. It is in their railroad range, so it has been made to a price point which is perhaps lower than some more quality steam locomotives. If you're thinking about buying this model, I'll tell you what I think is good and also what I think is bad. So some of the things I like about this model is the dulled metal of the valve gear. That's really quite nice. It makes it look more realistic and prototypical. I also like the handrails on the tender and around the cab, and the railings around the coal at the top of the tender. And talking of the tender, I do like all the rivet detail down the side of it, which looks really quite good. And one final thing is that I'm so happy that this has a NEM pocket on the back of the tender, because these Hornby couplings really wind me up. On the downside, I think the movement on the front pony is quite excessive, and I'm not sure how that's going to handle some point work, especially if you haven't laid it that well. The weight of the locomotive is also going to be a problem because it's only 200 grams, and so it would really benefit from some additional weight being added into this model. I think the motor is going to handle it no problem at all. It looks quite a substantial motor, and the gearbox looks pretty good as well. So I would have no problems putting extra weight into this in order to be able to confidently pull longer trains. You can see that it doesn't have a lot of decoration on this model. It's just got the number and the LMS on the tender. That is probably prototypical, but I think it also could benefit from things like the shed plates being picked out and a few other small pieces here and there. But the overall result is this looks like quite a dull locomotive. That could be quite typical of this locomotive of this era, in that it probably was quite dull. But if you were to weather this model a little bit, I think it would vastly improve it. So finally, my conclusion on this is that it is an interesting model to have. It's not a display model by any means, but it is a solid model that you can add to your collection and feel confident that it will run nicely and do sterling work on your layout. I hope you liked this video. Please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and you can give this a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this. I'll put this on the turntable so you can see all the way around. Don't forget to check out my books on Amazon. But that's it for today. See you next time.